On the line with us is one of my heroes, Joy Ann Reid, the journalist, host of MSNBC's The Readout. It's one of the programs that is on my daily to must watch list. Joy Ann Reid goes places where a lot of reporters don't, and commentators, and just does such a great job. And I'm so pleased to have her on the program. She has a new book out. It's Medgar and Myrlie, Medgar Evers and the Love Story That Awakened America. It's absolutely brilliant. Joy Ann Reid, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you with us. By the way,
if this was the radio show, I would say long-time listener, first-time caller. I'm such a huge fan of yours, and so I am fangirling a little bit just being on here with you, because I am a very long-time fan of what you do.
Well, thank you. And in fact, I wanted to apologize to you. I was on your program a few months ago, or maybe a year ago. And it was almost 2 weeks after I'd had back surgery. And after I got off the air, I turned to my wife, or I went downstairs and asked Louise, how did the hit go? And she was like, "You were grinning through that whole thing. Did you take a pain pill?" And I was like, "Yeah, I did." So I'm sorry.
You have to come back and do it soon. I was listening to you talking about the Koch brothers, and I literally started texting my bookers and like, get that man back on the show, because this is like the conversation I keep trying to get people to have, that it's the oligarchs.
Yeah, it
Pay
really
attention
is.
to the oligarchs.
It really is, and I so respect how often you go there, and how so many other people in our business just don't. But let's talk about Medgar and Myrlie. You have written an absolutely brilliant book. I'm only 3/4 of the way through it. I'm sorry, I haven't gotten to the last 2 chapters or so. But I've got questions and comments and thoughts, and let's just touch on this. First of all, Medgar Evers and Myrlie. For people who don't know who they are, living under a rock or whatever, or young people, give us the overview to begin with.
Well, and I'll say that it's not even young people or people under a rock. I mean, Medgar Evers in general is not that well known. There are people who are from Mississippi, who grew up in Mississippi, who don't know who he is. And the airport in Jackson is named after him. And a lot of people really don't know who he is, which is sort of a sad thing about the way we teach history in the country.
Yeah.
So Medgar Evers was the first field secretary for the NAACP. If you think about Vernon Jordan, who we all remember was Bill Clinton's friend, he was the field secretary in Georgia. At the same time, Medgar Evers was the field secretary in Mississippi. And what that means is that the NAACP hired him to do 3 things. His job was to investigate the lynchings of Black people and report that back to the organization, which was trying to push for a anti-lynching law, federal legislation. So their job was to try to generate legislation to do something about the ills of Black folks. So he would investigate these crimes. His second job was to sign people up for NAACP memberships and to register Black folks to vote in a state where, they had to technically follow the 15th Amendment, but they had all sorts of tricks and chicanery, but also threats and the Klan to keep Black folks from voting, which, by the way, if you can't register to vote, you can't serve on juries. So there were all of these ways of suppressing Black people in Mississippi. So that was his job. Myrlie Evers Williams now, she was an adorable, poised little 17-year-old who was in a girls singing group in rural Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the two of them met when Medgar came home from World War II, where he fought on Omaha Beach and joined and went back to college. They met on the first day of college at Alcorn State University and had this wonderful romance, and the rest is partly tragic but partly wonderful history.
I thought it was beautiful the way you are. Really, I mean, this book is the history of a large part of the civil rights movement during that era. And, being told through the story of this beautiful love story of these 2 people, it was just, I had no idea that he had served in the military, that he'd been on Omaha Beach on D-Day and all those kind of things. I mean, that was quite remarkable. And then when he came back to Mississippi, there was this exception to the poll tax rule that had to do with returning veterans, and apparently Mississippi's white elders didn't realize how many Black Mississippians had volunteered for World War II or been drafted for that matter. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, it just goes to show you that racism and intelligence generally don't go together.
There you go.
And so what happened was, yes, the state of Mississippi had a poll tax that was not, and this is another thing that, and you do this a lot, Tom, which I love about the way that you do what you do. People often forget that the war against Black people, going all the way back from enslavement till after enslavement, of trying to drive Black people back to the plantations and into secondary civic life, was also a war on white poor people.
Yep.
Because they too were subjected to the poll tax. The poll tax meant that if you didn't have a certain amount of money to be able to pay this special tax, you couldn't vote whether you were white or Black. But the sort of elders of Mississippi, the planter class that still ran Mississippi, even though slavery was long gone, they decided to do this exemption for the poll tax for their boys who'd gone off to World War II, to let them vote when they came back, the men, because of course, they were more interested in them than they were in anything that women could do. But they forgot that, lots of Black men had also signed up and gone off to World War II, including both Medgar and Charles Evers. And so when these Black men came back, they said, the law says we're also exempt from the poll tax, so we want to register to vote. And so Medgar and Charles and some of their friends who were fellow veterans marched down to the voter registrar in their little town and tried to register to vote, and were met with violent resistance by hundreds, about 200 armed white men who tried to prevent them from registering. They ended up registering, but they were prevented from actually voting in that 1946 election by an even larger cadre of armed white men. But it really showed that the fight to keep the franchise out of the hands of Black, men, Black people at the time, it was a four-square full operation that went from the top of the government all the way down to the Klan.
Yeah, it absolutely did. In your book, one of the next chapters is about the impact of the murder of Emmett Till and the brave decision that his mother made to have an open casket, and Reverend George Washington Lee and Amos Brown. There's a whole complex and fascinating story here. You want to tell that?
Absolutely. And so, Reverend Lee is the original version of what Emmett Till became. He was lynched because he was trying to register folks to vote. He was taking voter registrations to the registrar in his small rural Mississippi town. The Klan pulled up beside his car, shot him in the face, shot his jaw off. And then, of course, the sheriff of that town claimed that his death was simply a car accident and that the injuries to his jaw were caused by his fillings flying out of his mouth, and that's what caused his injuries, and not the Klan. But everyone in that community knew that the Klan had done it. I mean, it was technically not illegal to kill Black people in this country until probably the 1970s or 80s, when you started seeing white men actually convicted for doing that. You just usually knew that it was like the purge, white people to blow off steam. The working class whites were sort of unleashed to kill at will. And blow off steam that way, because of course that kept them distracted from the fact that they were getting nothing from the planter class economically. They kept them distracted with hating and killing Black people. And so when Reverend Lee was killed, his wife Rosebud decided that if they were going to murder her husband, the world was going to force to see it. And so she opened the casket at this funeral, and that actually became the inspiration for Mamie Till Mobley. And she did the same thing with little Emmett Till. And when he was lynched, it showed how brazen the Mississippi Klan was, because even though his family was from Mississippi, his uncle who he was staying with, that was his mom's family, he was from Chicago. And killing a northern boy was usually a bridge too far, even for the Klan. But the fact that they still lynched this 14-year-old boy, and that Mamie Till Mobley decided she was going to do a Reverend Lee and open the casket, it turned that lynching into an international scandal. Was that case, and that was the first big case that Medgar Evers investigated as the NAACP field secretary, and he managed to get 3 Black witnesses to risk their lives, including Emmett's uncle, to testify in that murder trial. The state had to put him on trial because it became a scandal that went beyond Mississippi, and it was an embarrassment to the state. So they put the 2 killers on trial, one of whom was also a World War II veteran. They were, of course, acquitted in 10 minutes. And those 3 Black witnesses, Medgar Evers' next job was to put them on the $11.50 train out of Mississippi into Chicago.
Absolutely remarkable. Tell us about the house on, is it Guynes Street? Is that how it's pronounced?
Guynes Street, yeah. So Guynes Street was a really special block in Jackson, Mississippi. It was actually developed by these two revolutionary in their own right, Black developers. And these men designed these houses. They were all kind of cookie cutter houses, like the way a subdivision would be. There was only one house that was two-story, which was Margaret Walker Alexander, the great African-American writer. She had the two-story house. All the other houses were one-story. And it was designed specifically for World War II veterans and their wives to be able to live in a middle-class subdivision in Jackson in a very segregated city. So the block was all Black because, of course, of segregation. And Margaret Walker Alexander was kind of the queen of the block. And Medgar and Myrlie moved there after being in rural Mound Bayou, where Myrlie was miserable, where there was no movie theater and nothing to do and bugs. And so she was happy to move to the city. But what was interesting about the block was, most of the people on the block were teachers. And when Medgar would go door to door and say, introduce himself, hi, I'm Medgar Evers, and are you a member of the NAACP? A lot of the teachers would say no, because you could be fired from your teaching job for joining the NAACP. So he would tell them, don't take that risk, just give us your dues. We need your money more than we need your numbers. So he would do things like that would annoy his bosses because they wanted the numbers and he knew he couldn't get them. People were afraid. But the other thing that was interesting about the block was that Medgar had his house specifically designed with no front door for security reasons, because he knew he was a target. He was on the Klan's hit list, at the top of the Klan's hit list for the whole 11 years that he and Myrlie were married. And so his house was designed with the door on the side. You had to come up the carport and then go in the house on the side so that the front window, you could see who might be coming. All the other houses have sloped roofs. This one, have flat roofs. This is the only one with a sloped roof so that no one could climb onto the roof and be able to come down into the house that way. So it was designed for security. And then, of course, the house was full of guns because Medgar was not Martin. He was not about that life. He was about the life of protecting himself. And so he had guns stashed all throughout the house in different rooms for security purposes. But the other piece I will say that when we did this book, myself and my team, we went down and we spent a lot of time in Jackson interviewing people. And we interviewed a bunch of people from that era who still live on Guynes Street, including Miss Myrlie's best friend, Miss Jo. She's now passed, who lived across the street. The family next door, who was her other best friend, who was too ill to talk with us, but her daughter, who was a witness to the murder, we interviewed her. And then the Sweets, who lived down the street, both the mother and the two now adult children, who really talked about the trauma for the kids on the block when the assassination happened right in the front of Myrlie and, right at their home. Right. That all the kids were traumatized for life. Medgar was the fun dad on the block. He was the one who would throw the football with the boys because he was a football player. He was the one who would throw the kids into his Oldsmobile and take them to the drive-in theater. And so a lot of what we talked with them about was the trauma of being a kid on this very safe block, which was their safe space.
It's heartwarming and horrifying at the same time, in part because of the era. Medgar and Myrlie, Medgar Evers and the love story that awakened America. We were just talking about the house on Guynes Street where he ultimately was assassinated right in front of the house. Can you tell me about some of the white allies who were working with him? You wrote about Hazel Brannon Smith and Reverend Ed King, for example.
Yeah, so Hazel Smith was a remarkable character. She was a newspaper woman, and she actually published 3 different, general market white newspapers. But she was one of the white people who partnered with Medgar, because one of the things that really bothered him as a kid growing up in Mississippi is that when someone was lynched, including a friend of his father's when he was about 11 years old, no one would say anything about it. It's like the person just dissolved into the earth, and Black people were too afraid to say anything. There were no protests. There were no, speeches about the person in church. The person would just disappear and no one would say anything, out of real just terror and fear. And so his thing was, if there are going to be lynchings and there are going to be murders and there's going to be discrimination, we need to be able to talk about it. So he founded this newspaper called the Mississippi Free Press, and he needed someone to print it. And this white woman volunteered to print it. She had been pro-segregation, but changed her mind after Brown v. Board and decided to become an ally. And she became the scourge of white society. She was no longer invited to be a part of white society, but then she would have these amazing dinner parties and have Black people there, and so she just was this sort of Renaissance woman who completely flipped her views and became an ally. The other person is Reverend Ed King, who was actually in many ways the closest advisor to Medgar Evers. He and John Salter, who was a white presenting indigenous man, but he looked white, so he lived as a white man. And Reverend King was a confidant of Medgar Evers, and he met him when Ed King was actually in college. And Medgar would bring together students at Black Tougaloo University and Alcorn together to have these interracial conversations and to help young white students understand the way Black people live. Because while they lived in the same city, because of segregation, they knew nothing about what Black people dealt with and what they went through. And as Ed King became closer to Medgar Evers, Medgar actually encouraged him to eventually become the chaplain at All Black Tougaloo University. So there were, white people involved intimately in this movement. And, Medgar's father used to say, there are three kinds of white people. There were the white people who would kill you just as soon look at you. There were the white people who would be your ally and, go into the fire with you. And then there were the what you would call sort of the useless kind of moderates who would see the injustice, think it's wrong, but do nothing about it. And so I think that's literally a story of what the movement was. It was an interracial movement, but the white allies who were willing to take part in it really were heroic because they were risking becoming, an anathema to their community, becoming outcasts, and also risking being killed, as we saw as Mr. Goodman and Mr. Schwerner were ultimately murdered in 1965.
And Mr. Cheney, yeah. Absolutely.
And Cheney, who was the local, and by the way, the funny thing about it is I call Medgar Evers the Forrest Gump of American history, of American civil rights history, because he's like involved in all these stories that you don't think he would be. James Cheney, who was the 20-year-old Black man who was killed with Goodman and Schwerner, was actually a young NAACP activist. His first act of civic activism was as a member of the NAACP youth leagues, stitching a hand-drawn NAACP memberships patch onto his clothing as a high school student and getting expelled. And Medgar trained a lot of these young activists who later participated in things like the Freedom Rides. He was involved in the Woolworth sit-in that was the most violent and famous sit-in that Mr. Salter was a part of. And also, he trained a lot of the young activists who actually became civil rights leaders, both Black and white.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. You talk about the Tougaloo Nine and also about the FBI and the wiretaps and whatnot that he was constantly under. We've got about 2 minutes to a hard break I can't control. So your thoughts on those? Or
very
those
quickly, and the thing is that the wiretaps weren't even the FBI. They were a state-controlled spy agency called the Sovereignty Commission. And he tried to tell the FBI that his phone was tapped, and they never did anything about it and didn't believe him. So it was a constant state of surveillance, including some Black folks that were taking money from the Sovereignty Commission to watch other people. It was a time of pure horror. It was the most dangerous state to be Black in America. And so Medgar Evers is a singular hero, but he couldn't have done it without Myrlie, who was his secretary, sounding board, the person who would read over his speeches and let him practice them with her. And they were a duo. And that's really the reason I wrote the book. That love story enabled him to do what he did. And then she took up the mantle afterwards and ensured justice for that killer, and also that the legacy of Medgar would go on.
Yeah, I thought one of the moments that really hit me was toward the end of the book when she was running politically and a member of the Beckwith family came in and said, "I'm a member of the Beckwith family."
Yeah, and he had been stalking her.
Yeah.
So yeah, when she moved to California, she still was never too far away from the sort of ramifications of that murder. It followed her, and she was very determined to get justice from the moment that the assassination happened until 30 years later when Byron De La Beckwith was sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah, finally. I mean, finally it consumed, it just wrapped up. But you have written an absolute masterpiece. It's rare that biographies are just so moving and so information filled. The book is Medgar and Myrlie, Medgar Evers and the Love Story That Awakened America. The author, of course, Joy Ann Reid, the host of the Re-Out on MSNBC. Joy Ann Reid, thank you today. It's great talking
Thank you, Tom. It's such an honor. It's so great to get to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure and my honor too. Thank you.